The crystal chandeliers of the Vanderbilt Grand Ballroom dripped light like frozen tears, each facet scattering a cold, brilliant fire across the sea of tailored suits and silk gowns. From her position near the service entrance, Alara watched the spectacle with the detached observation of a ghost. She was present, but unseen, a functional shadow in a world of blinding substance. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and blooming lilies, a fragrance so cloying it felt like a weight in her lungs. The low hum of 100 conversations of stock portfolios and European vacations, of political gossip and art auctions, was a language she understood but could never speak. In her hands, a heavy silver tray held a dozen flutes of champagne, the tiny bubbles rising in a frantic, silent dance. Her black dress, a simple, severe uniform provided by the Vanderbilts, was a stark contrast to the glittering couture that surrounded her. It was a constant, wearable reminder of her place. Not family, not guest, not even a paid servant with a name on a payroll. She was simply Alara, the charity case, the orphan the late Mrs. Vanderbilt had taken in years ago, and whom the rest of the family had tolerated with the begrudging duty one affords an inherited, unwanted piece of furniture. She moved through the crowd with a practiced grace, her steps silent on the marble floor. Her face was a placid mask, revealing none of the turmoil that churned within her. 18 years of living on the periphery had taught her the art of invisibility. To survive in the Vanderbilt household was to anticipate needs without being asked to solve problems before they were noticed, and above all, to never ever draw attention to oneself. Her eyes scanned the room, automatically tracking the key players. Mr. Vanderbilt, a formidable man with a face carved from granite, and disappointment was deep in conversation with a senator, his laugh a low rumbling sound that held no warmth. And then there was Serafina. Serafina Vanderbilt was everything Alara was not. She stood at the center of the room, a vision in emerald green, her laughter light and musical drawing a circle of admirers around her, like moths to a flawless flame. She was the sun around which this entire universe orbited, and she wore her privilege with an effortless, almost bored grace. Beside her, his hand possessively on the small of her back, was Damian Blackwood. If Serafina was the sun, Damian was her shadow, a darker, more dangerous heat. Heir to the Blackwood banking fortune, he moved with the predatory confidence of a man who had never been told no. His smile was a sharp, handsome slash that never quite reached his eyes, which were the color of cold steel. Alara had learned long ago to give him a wide berth. His brand of casual cruelty was the most dangerous of all, for it required no reason, only opportunity. "More champagne over here," a voice called out, and Alara turned her internal compass, guiding her toward the sound. She navigated the tight cluster of guests, her tray held high and steady. She was only a few feet from Damian and Serafina's group when it happened. It was not a clumsy stumble or a careless jostle from the crowd. It was a deliberate, subtle extension of a polished leather shoe. Damian's shoe. Alara's foot caught her balance, thrown into chaos. For a sickening moment, the world tilted, a dizzying kaleidoscope of light and faces. The tray tipped, and the crystal flutes slid crashing against each other in a horrible final chime before their liquid gold contents arced through the air. The champagne, a vintage Dom Perignon that cost more than a year's worth of groceries, drenched the front of a woman in a pale Dior gown. The woman was Mrs. Harrington, wife of the very investor Mr. Vanderbilt had been trying to court for months. A collective gasp rippled through the room. The hum of conversation died, replaced by a sudden suffocating silence. Every eye turned to the epicenter of the disaster, to Alara standing frozen amidst the wreckage of shattered glass and spreading wine, her face pale with shock. Mrs. Harrington let out a shriek of outrage, staring down at the dark, spreading stain on her dress, as if she had been physically wounded. "My Dior, it's ruined." Damian stepped forward, his expression a perfect blend of feigned surprise and theatrical concern. "Are you all right, Mrs. Harrington? How dreadful." He then turned his cold eyes on Alara, and the mask of concern dropped, replaced by a sneer of pure contempt. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it cut through the silence with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "Look what you've done, you clumsy little fool." Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. She wanted the marble floor to swallow her whole. I'm so sorry," she stammered, bending down to pick up the pieces of broken glass, her hands trembling. "I tripped. Damian laughed, a short, ugly sound. "People like you are always tripping." It's a wonder the Vanderbilts let you handle anything more valuable than a dust rag. He took another step closer, lowering his voice into a conspiratorial whisper that was somehow audible to everyone in the vicinity. "You have to understand," he said to the guests around them. "She's a charity case. An orphan Eleanor Vanderbilt picked up from some gutter. They've given her a roof over her head, clothes on her back, and this is the gratitude she shows. No breeding, you see. You can take the girl out of the slums, but you can't take the slums out of the girl." Each word was a physical blow. Charity case. Gutter. Slums. The familiar venomous labels he had used against her in private were now laid bare for the entire world to hear. Her cheeks burned with a humiliation so hot it felt like a fever. She looked desperately toward Serafina, a silent plea for intervention for any small gesture of defense. Serafina met her gaze for a fleeting second. There was no pity in her eyes, no solidarity. There was only a cold, faint flicker of annoyance, as if Alara were a fly buzzing too close to her ear. Then she turned away, placing a delicate, comforting hand on Mrs. Harrington's arm, and murmuring apologies for the unfortunate incident. She had rendered Alara invisible once more, erasing her not with a word, but with a simple, dismissive turn of her head. Mr. Vanderbilt finally strode over his face a thundercloud of controlled rage. He did not look at Alara. He addressed the space she occupied. "Clean this mess up. Now. And then get out of my sight." His voice was low and menacing, the final nail in the coffin of her public execution. Without another word, she gathered the last of the broken glass onto her tray. Her head bowed to hide the tears that threatened to fall. She could feel the stares of 100 people on her back as she walked a single, slow journey of shame back toward the service entrance and away from the glittering world she would never be a part of. The hum of conversation slowly resumed behind her, the incident already being absorbed into the night's tapestry of gossip, a minor diversion now concluded. She did not stop in the kitchen. She continued up the winding servants' staircase past the silent, polished hallways of the family wing, her steps echoing in the sudden quiet. Up and up she went to the very top of the house, to the one place that was hers. Her room in the attic was a world away from the ballroom below. It was small and stark, with a steeply sloped ceiling and a single round window that looked out over the darkened gardens. A narrow bed, a small wooden desk, and a threadbare rug were the only furnishings. It was a cell, but it was her sanctuary. Here at least she could breathe. She set the tray down with a clatter, and finally let the tears come hot and silent. They were not tears of sadness, but of a deep, bone-weary rage. Rage at Damien's cruelty, at Serafina's indifference, at Mr. Vanderbilt's cold disdain. Rage at the gilded cage she had lived in for a decade, where the bars were made of obligation and unspoken rules. She sank onto the edge of her bed, her gaze falling on a small, worn wooden box on her desk. It was the only thing of real value she possessed, a memory box containing the few items left to her by Eleanor Vanderbilt, who had passed away 2 years prior. Mrs. Vanderbilt had been the only one to show her genuine kindness, the only one who had seen her as a person rather than a project. With trembling fingers, Alara opened the box. The familiar scent of dried lavender and old paper filled the small room. Inside lay a stack of letters tied with a faded ribbon, a silver locket with a faded photograph of a smiling woman Alara didn't know, and a few of Mrs. Vanderbilt's favorite books. It was in moments like this, moments of profound loneliness and despair, that she would come here to touch these objects, as if their connection to the one person who had loved her could offer some small measure of comfort. She picked up a slim volume of poetry by Rilke, its leather cover softened with age. Mrs. Vanderbilt used to read to her from this very book on rainy afternoons. As she listlessly flipped through the thin, delicate pages, something heavy slipped from between them and fell to the floor with a soft metallic thud. Alara frowned, bending down to see what it was. It was a key. It was unlike any key she had ever seen. It was not brassy or new, but made of a dark, heavy metal that seemed to drink the light in the room. It was old, clearly handmade, with a long, slender shaft and an intricate bit. But it was the head of the key that held her attention. It wasn't a simple loop, but was forged into a strange, elegant symbol, a stylized serpent coiled around a single leafless branch. It felt ancient, powerful, and utterly out of place among the simple belongings of her adopted mother. She had been through this box 100 times. How had she never seen it before? It must have been tucked deep within the book's spine. She held it in her palm, its weight cool and solid against her skin. It felt like more than just a key. It felt like a question, a secret. Outside her small window, the party continued a distant, muffled echo of a life she couldn't have. But here, in her cold attic room, clutching this mysterious piece of metal, a tiny, unfamiliar spark ignited within Alara's chest. It was not yet hope, not yet a plan. It was something far more fundamental. It was the sudden, startling possibility that somewhere in this grand, cruel house, there was a lock, and that she, the invisible girl the charity case, might finally hold the means to open it. The morning sun cast long, slanted shadows across the attic floor, but brought no warmth. Alara awoke to the ghost of last night's humiliation, a sour taste in her mouth and a dull ache behind her eyes. Sleep had offered little respite, her dreams filled with a cacophony of shattering glass and Damien's cutting laughter. The weight of his words charity case gutter slums had settled deep in her bones, a cold, heavy burden. She pushed aside the thin blanket and rose the chill of the room, a stark reminder of her isolation. The distant sounds of the household stirring to life drifted up from below the clatter of silverware, the murmur of the morning staff, the life of the Vanderbilt estate proceeding as if her public evisceration had never happened. To them it was already forgotten. To her it was a fresh scar on top of old wounds. There was only one place she could go to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the house. Pulling on a simple cotton dress and worn boots, she slipped out of her room and down the servants' staircase, a wraith moving through the waking mansion. She bypassed the kitchens, avoiding the pitying or scornful glances of the staff, and exited through a small forgotten door at the back of the house. The moment she stepped outside, the world changed. The air was cool and clean, fragrant with the scent of damp earth, blooming roses, and freshly cut grass. The Vanderbilt Gardens were her true sanctuary, a sprawling 10-acre masterpiece of landscape design. There were the formal sections near the main terrace with their geometric hedge mazes and classical statues. But Alara's path always led her further to the wilder, more secluded areas. A weeping willow that trailed its branches into a placid koi pond. A hidden grove of birch trees whose white bark seemed to glow in the early morning light. And at the very heart of it all, the magnificent rose garden. It was here she found him. Liam was kneeling beside a bed of deep crimson roses, his hands covered in thin leather gloves, moving with a gentle, focused precision as he pruned away dead leaves. He was the estate's youngest gardener, a quiet figure who had appeared a few months ago and blended into the scenery as seamlessly as the ancient oaks that lined the property. Alara knew little about him, only that he possessed a stillness that was rare in this house of constant frantic performance. He looked up as she approached his work, uninterrupted. He didn't offer a greeting of deference or surprise, merely a small, quiet smile of acknowledgement. His eyes, a warm, intelligent shade of hazel, held none of the judgment or pity she had been steeling herself against. They simply saw her. "Good morning, Alara," he said, his voice low and steady. "Good morning, Liam." She stopped a few feet away, wrapping her arms around herself. The key from last night was tucked safely in her pocket, its strange shape a secret comfort against her hip. "The black baccara roses are finally blooming," he said, gesturing with his shears toward the velvety, near-black petals of the flower he was tending. "They thrive on cool mornings after a bit of stress." A paradox, isn't it? Alara understood the unspoken meaning. He had heard what happened. Of course he had. News, especially of the scandalous variety, traveled faster than fire through the household staff. But instead of offering clumsy condolences, he offered a botanical metaphor. He gave her the dignity of her own interpretation. "Some things are strongest in the dark, I suppose," she replied softly. He nodded, returning to his work. They fell into a comfortable silence, broken only by the snip of his shears and the chirping of sparrows in the overhead branches. Alara felt the tight knot of tension in her shoulders begin to unwind. Here, surrounded by the patient, silent life of the garden with this quiet man who demanded nothing from her, she could almost forget the suffocating weight of being the Vanderbilt's resident ghost. After a few minutes, Liam finished his pruning, removed his gloves, and wiped his hands on his trousers. He moved to a stone bench under a large magnolia tree, pulling a worn canvas satchel from beside it. From the satchel, he retrieved a heavy, leather-bound book and a crisp green apple. "Would you like one?" he asked, offering her the apple. She hesitated, then accepted. Thank you. The simple gesture of sharing of being offered something without condition felt so foreign it was almost startling. She bit into the apple, its sweet, sharp taste a burst of simple pleasure. Liam opened his book, his long fingers tracing the lines of text. Alara watched him, her curiosity piqued. He didn't fit the mold of a typical gardener. There was an intellectual air about him, a refined quality to his features, that seemed at odds with his manual labor. And he was always reading not flimsy paperbacks, but substantial scholarly-looking tomes. "What are you reading?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked up, his hazel eyes lighting with a subtle enthusiasm. "It's a history of the county," he explained, focusing on the founding families from the Gilded Age, the Vanderbilts, the Blackwoods, and the ones who have been forgotten. Forgotten. "History is written by the victors," he said, a wry twist to his lips, "and sometimes by those who are simply the last ones standing. Entire dynasties can vanish from the public record if there's no one left to tell their story." He turned a few pages, the thick paper making a soft rustling sound. "I find the lost stories more interesting. I'm on a chapter about family crests and heraldry. It's fascinating how much you can tell about a family's values and history just from the symbols they chose to represent themselves." He angled the book so she could see. The page was filled with intricate hand-drawn illustrations of coats of arms. Lions for courage, oaks for strength, ships for commerce. Alara leaned closer, her eyes scanning the complex designs. And then she saw it. Her breath caught in her throat. There in the bottom right corner of the page was a crest that made her heart stop. It was rendered in black ink, stark and elegant against the creamy parchment. A serpent, intricately detailed with tiny scales, was coiled around the bare, leafless branch of a tree. It was the exact symbol from the key in her pocket. The apple suddenly tasted like ash in her mouth. She felt a wave of dizziness, a sense of falling through time. Her hand instinctively went to her pocket, her fingers closing around the cool, solid metal of the key. "What is it?" Liam asked, noticing the sudden pallor of her face. "That one," she said, her voice thin and unsteady. She pointed a trembling finger at the illustration. "That crest. Whose is it?" Liam followed her gaze, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Ah, that one. It's a tragic story, actually." He tapped the text beneath the image. "That is the crest of the Illyrian family. Alarion." The name was completely alien to her, yet it landed in her mind with the force of a revelation. They were one of the most brilliant families of their time. Liam continued, his voice taking on the quality of a storyteller. Not old money, but innovators. They made their fortune in emergent technologies of the era: telegraphy, early electrical engineering. They were said to be philanthropists, patrons of the arts, but also intensely private. Then, about 3 generations ago, they just vanished. "Vanished," Alara whispered. "What do you mean?" "The historical record is unclear. There was a terrible accident, a fire, I believe. The last direct heirs, a young couple, were lost. Their entire estate, their fortune, their company, it all seemed to disappear overnight. No one knew what happened to their assets. They became a local legend, the lost family of fortune. Some say they hid their wealth away, that it's still out there somewhere waiting for a lost heir to reclaim it." Alara stared at the symbol, her mind racing. A lost heir. The key. Mrs. Vanderbilt, who had given her a home but had always seemed to carry a secret sadness in her eyes. It couldn't be a coincidence. It was too specific, too impossible. Before she could form another question, a sharp, arrogant voice shattered the morning peace. Well, look what we have here. The little charity mouse consorting with the dirt digger." Damian Blackwood stood at the edge of the rose garden, dressed in impeccable riding gear. His lip was curled in the familiar sneer as he surveyed the scene, his eyes lingering on Alara with possessive contempt, as if even her moments of quiet solitude belonged to him to spoil. Alara flinched instinctively, taking a step back. Liam, however, did not move. He remained seated on the bench, his posture relaxed, his gaze steady as he slowly closed his book. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwood." Liam set his tone perfectly level, betraying no sign of intimidation. Damian ignored him, his focus entirely on Alara. "I trust you've recovered from your little performance last night. Vanderbilt is still furious. You're lucky he didn't throw you out on the street where you belong." "That's enough," Damian. Alara said, a spark of defiance flaring through her fear. Damian's eyes widened in mock surprise. "Oh, she speaks. and so bravely. Did your little gardener friend here give you a backbone? He finally turned his attention to Liam, looking him up and down as one might inspect an insect. You. I want the fountain on the west lawn drained and scrubbed. Today. And then I want you to go dig a new compost trench behind the stables. A deep one. It was a blatant display of dominance and order given not out of need but for the sheer pleasure of giving it. Liam met his gaze without flinching. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his hazel eyes. Certainly, sir, he replied, his voice still infuriatingly calm. Regarding the compost trench, shall I follow the Roman principles of fossa fastigiata for optimal drainage and aeration, or is a more rudimentary trough sufficient for your purposes? Damien blinked. A look of dull confusion clouded his handsome features. The what? Fossa fastigiata, Liam repeated, enunciating the Latin term with perfect clarity. A V-shaped trench, far more efficient for decomposition than a simple flat-bottomed one. Of course it requires more precise excavation. I just want to ensure I'm meeting your exact specifications. The intellectual barb, delivered with the polite deference of a servant, was a masterpiece of subtle warfare. It sailed completely over Damien's head, but the implication that he didn't know what Liam was talking about was clear. A dark flush crept up Damien's neck. He had been made to feel stupid, and by someone he considered his absolute inferior. Just dig the damn ditch, you smart-mouthed peasant! He snarled, his composure cracking. He shot a final venomous glare at Alara. Stay away from the help, Alara. It's unseemly. With that, he turned on his heel and strode away, his back rigid with fury. The silence he left behind was thick with unspoken things. Alara looked at Liam, a newfound respect dawning in her eyes. He hadn't cowered. He hadn't argued. He had used his intelligence as a shield, deflecting Damien's brute force with an effortless grace. Liam simply reopened his book, though Alara suspected he wasn't really reading. My apologies, he said after a moment. I shouldn't have provoked him. No, Alara said, a real smile touching her lips for the first time that day. It was brilliant. Thank you. He looked up and their eyes met. In that moment a bond was forged, an unspoken understanding between two people who could see the rot beneath the gilded surface of the Vanderbilt world. He saw her as more than a charity case, and she now saw him as far more than just a gardener. Her hand closed around the key in her pocket once more. The symbol carved into its head no longer felt just mysterious. It felt like a destination. It had a name. Illyrian. The name of a lost family, a lost fortune. And somehow, impossibly, it was now connected to her. The key was no longer just a question. It was the beginning of an answer. The name Illyrian echoed in the silent chambers of Alara's mind, a single resonant chord that vibrated through her entire being. It was more than a name. It was an anchor in the storm of her identity, a first solid piece of ground in a life spent adrift. The weight of the key in her pocket was a constant physical reminder of the mystery. It was no longer a curious trinket, but a tangible link to a past she never knew. She had a promise of a truth that lay hidden, somewhere within the stone and timber of the Vanderbilt estate. For the rest of the day she moved through her duties in a daze, her thoughts a world away from the polishing of silver and the folding of linens. Every corner of the mansion now seemed to hold a secret, every shadow seemed to whisper the forgotten name. The faces of the Vanderbilt family, once simply the arbiters of her small existence, were now transformed into masks, their every word and gesture a potential clue in a decade-long deception. The humiliation of the party had not faded, but it had been transmuted from a source of shame into a source of fuel. Her anger was no longer a diffuse, helpless thing. It was a focused, cold fire. She knew with an instinct she couldn't explain that the lock this key belonged to would not be in some dusty, forgotten corner. A secret of this magnitude would be hidden in the very heart of the Vanderbilt dynasty's power. And in this house, the heart was the library. It was a room that was more of a museum than a functional space. Mr. Vanderbilt, a man of modern appetites and little patience for the past, conducted his business in a sleek glass-walled office in the newly built East Wing. The library was a relic of his grandfather Augustus Vanderbilt, the patriarch whose stern oil-painted gaze presided over the cavernous room. It was a place of shadows and silence, filled with the scent of old leather and decaying paper, a perfect tomb for a buried truth. That night Alara waited until the great house had settled into its slumber. The rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the main hall was the only sound, a slow, steady heartbeat in the sleeping giant. Dressed in dark clothing, she slipped from her attic room, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden stairs. She moved with the familiarity of a ghost, her path illuminated by the pale moonlight slanting through the tall, arched windows. The house, which had so often felt like her prison, was now a landscape of opportunity, its familiar shadows offering her cover. The two massive oak doors of the library were unlocked. She pushed one open just enough to slip through the hinges, groaning softly in protest. She closed it behind her, plunging herself into a darkness so profound it felt like velvet. For a moment she stood perfectly still, her senses on high alert, listening for any sign of discovery. There was only the whisper of a draft and the frantic thumping of her own heart. Slowly her eyes adjusted. Moonlight filtered through the towering stained glass windows, painting ghostly patterns on the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves that lined every wall. The room was a cathedral of knowledge filled with thousands of books that no one ever read. And there on the far wall, dominating the space above the cold marble fireplace, was him. The portrait of Augustus Vanderbilt was a masterpiece of intimidating artistry. He was depicted seated in a throne-like chair, his hand resting on a globe, his eyes rendered with an unnerving realism, seeming to follow her as she moved. He was the architect of the family's fortune, the revered ancestor whose legacy of ruthlessness and ambition was the foundation upon which their current lives were built. He was Alara, now suspected the architect of her lie. Her hand went to her pocket, her fingers closing around the cold, heavy key. Her intuition screamed that the answer was here with him. She moved toward the fireplace, her steps soundless on the thick Persian rug. Standing before the portrait, she felt a tremor of fear. It felt like an act of profound sacrilege to challenge the patriarch, even his painted likeness. She forced the feeling down, replacing it with a cold resolve. She began her search, her fingers tracing the ornate gilded frame of the massive painting. It was a riot of carved acanthus leaves and intricate scrollwork, a perfect place to hide something small. She ran her hands over every inch, pressing gently, feeling for any give, any hint of a hidden mechanism. Minutes ticked by. The clock in the hall chimed two each, stroke a hammer blow in the silence. Nothing. Frustration began to prick at her. Was she wrong? Had she imagined it all? She leaned back, her eyes scanning the frame one last time. And then she saw it. It was almost invisible, a flaw so subtle it was practically a stroke of genius. Tucked within the deepest recess of a carved leaf, positioned just below Augustus Vanderbilt's painted hand, was a tiny dark hole no bigger than the head of a pin. It wasn't a flaw in the design. It was the design. A keyhole. Her breath hitched. With a trembling hand, she retrieved the Illyrian key from her pocket. The bit was slender, the design complex. It looked as if it would never fit. She held her breath and guided the tip of the key into the tiny opening. It slid in with a smooth, perfect precision. For a moment she hesitated. This was the point of no return. Once this lock was turned, nothing would ever be the same. The image of Damien's sneer, of Seraphina's cold dismissal, flashed in her mind. She turned the key. The sound was shockingly loud in the silent room. A solid, definitive click echoed off the high ceilings, a sound of finality, of revelation. For a second, nothing happened. Then, with a low groan of protesting mechanics, the entire portrait swung inward, revealing a dark square cavity recessed into the wall. Inside the cavity sat a heavy iron safe, its black surface dull and imposing. There was another lock on the safe, a more modern combination dial. Alara's heart sank. A new obstacle. But as she leaned closer, she saw something else. Tucked into a small ledge just above the dial was a folded piece of yellowed paper. She picked it up. On it, in Mrs. Vanderbilt's elegant, familiar script, was a sequence of numbers. A wave of love and gratitude for the one woman who had cared for her washed over Alara. Eleanor Vanderbilt had not only preserved the secret, she had left her a path to find it. Alara's fingers, now steady, turned the dial, aligning the numbers. She pulled the heavy handle and the safe door swung open with a deep, resonant groan. The interior was not filled with gold bars or glittering jewels as a younger Alara might have fantasized. It was far more valuable. Lying on a bed of faded red velvet was a single weathered leather folio tied shut with a brittle ribbon. With reverent hands she lifted it out. It was surprisingly heavy. She carried it to the large mahogany desk in the center of the room, switched on the small green banker's lamp, and sat down in Augustus Vanderbilt's imposing leather chair. The moment felt surreal. The servant girl, the orphan, sitting in the seat of power, about to unravel the secret of her own life. She untied the ribbon, its fibers crumbling under her touch. She opened the folio. The first thing she saw was a letter, the paper so thin and delicate it was almost translucent. The ink was faded, the handwriting an elegant looping script she did not recognize. It began, "My dearest daughter Alara." Tears welled in her eyes as she read the words of the parents she had never known. The letter was a torrent of love, grief, and desperate hope. They were Richard and Liana Alarion, the last of their line. They wrote of their immense joy at her birth and their terrible fear for the future. They explained that they had made powerful enemies, dangerous rivals, who coveted their innovative work and their fortune. They feared their time was short. They had made a choice, a terrible, necessary choice, to protect their only child. They had turned to their oldest and most trusted friend, Augustus Vanderbilt, to be her guardian. "He has sworn to us," her mother wrote, "that he will raise you as his own, protect you, and see that you inherit the legacy we have built for you. All that we are, all that we have, is now yours. We only pray that the world is a kinder place when you read this. Know that we love you more than life itself. Never forget that you are an Illyrian." Alara's tears fell onto the fragile paper, blurring the loving words. She wept for the parents she never knew, for the life of love and belonging that had been stolen from her. After several minutes, she carefully set the letter aside and turned to the other documents in the folio. They were thick, official-looking, and bound in legal tape. The top page read, "The last will and testament and trust formation of Richard and Liana Alarion." She began to read, her initial grief slowly giving way to a dawning, electrifying shock. The legal language was dense, but the meaning was brutally, astonishingly clear. Augustus Vanderbilt was named not as an heir, but as the executor and primary trustee. The document outlined the transfer of the entire Alarion portfolio stocks, patents, properties, and a vast sum of liquid capital into a trust. This trust was the seed from which Vanderbilt Industries, the Vanderbilt estate, everything had grown. The terms were explicit. Augustus and his descendants were to act as stewards, managing and growing the assets. For this service, they were to be granted a generous annual stipend, a fortune in itself, to ensure their comfort and loyalty. But they were not under any circumstances the owners. And then she came to the final damning clause. Upon the 18th birthday of the sole beneficiary, Alara Alarion, the trust was to be dissolved, and the entirety of its assets, including all companies and properties founded with its capital, were to be transferred immediately and irrevocably into her sole possession. Alara stared at the page, her mind struggling to comprehend the scale of the betrayal. Her 18th birthday had been 6 months ago. Her entire life was a lie. Her poverty, her servitude, her status as a charity case. It was all a monstrous, calculated fiction designed to keep her ignorant of the truth. They hadn't just taken her in. They had stolen her life, her name, her birthright. The Vanderbilts were not her saviors. They were her jailers. And the very house she served the ground, she walked on the air she breathed, it was all hers. A cold, hard clarity washed over her, chilling her to the bone and extinguishing the last of her tears. The meek, fearful orphan who had crept into the library hours ago was gone. In her place sat an heiress, forged in the fires of a decade of humiliation and a single earth-shattering revelation. She slowly raised her head and looked at the portrait of Augustus Vanderbilt, whose painted eyes still seemed to watch her from the shadows. She felt no fear, no intimidation. She looked into the face of the man who had betrayed his closest friends and stolen a child's future, and she felt only the icy calm of a declared war. The gilded cage had been unlocked, and the creature inside was finally ready to be set free. The first light of dawn bled through the stained glass windows of the library, casting long jeweled patterns across the room. Alara had not slept. She sat in the patriarch's chair, the leather cool against her skin. The documents that had rewritten her world spread before her like a declaration of war. The initial storm of emotion, the grief, the shock, the white-hot rage had subsided, leaving in its wake a terrifying, crystalline calm. She understood with absolute clarity that the truth was not a shield, but a weapon. And a weapon was only as effective as the person who wielded it. To burst into Mr. Vanderbilt's office to confront Damien and Serafina with tearful accusations and brandished papers would be a fatal mistake. They were powerful, connected, and utterly without scruple. They would paint her as hysterical, delusional. They would have her committed, declared incompetent. The documents and the truth they held would disappear into the same darkness that had swallowed her parents. No. A decade of silent observation had taught her the art of strategy. She would not be the storm that breaks down the door. She would be the poison that seeps into the foundation, silent and unseen, until the entire rotten structure collapsed upon itself. Her first priority was to secure her weapon. Using the faint light, she carefully placed the trust documents and will back into the leather folio, tied the crumbling ribbon, and returned it to the safe. She locked it, then swung the heavy portrait of Augustus Vanderbilt back into place, the mechanism closing with a soft final click. The secret was safe once more. But she kept the letter from her parents, folding it carefully and tucking it into a hidden pocket sewn into the lining of her dress. It was her heart, her reason, the reminder of who she was fighting for. The key remained in her other pocket, a cold, hard promise. Her mind was already working, assembling a plan. The documents had mentioned a law firm, Finch, Covington & Crowe. They were named as an alternate executor to be contacted in the event of suspected malfeasance or a breach of trust. It was a contingency her parents had wisely put in place, a lifeline stretching across the decades. She had to reach them. That morning, Alara transformed back into the ghost. She performed her duties with a quiet, unobtrusive efficiency that drew no notice. She cleaned, she dusted, she served breakfast. Her face an unreadable mask of subservience. Inside, however, a new awareness was alive and burning. Every object she touched, the heavy silverware, the fine china, the polished mahogany furniture, was hers. Every condescending glance from Mr. Vanderbilt, every dismissive wave from Serafina, was a fresh deposit into the growing account of their crimes. She needed a way out of the estate, a plausible reason to be gone for most of the day without raising suspicion. The opportunity came in the form of a complaint from Serafina. "These drapes are atrocious," Serafina announced at the breakfast table, gesturing disdainfully toward the heavy velvet curtains in the morning room. "This shade of burgundy is positively funereal. I want them replaced, and the old ones need to be taken to that specialty cleaner in the old quarter, the one that deals with antique fabrics. It's a dreadful trip and the regular driver is busy." It was the perfect opening. "I can take them," Miss Vanderbilt, Alara said softly, stepping forward. "I have nothing scheduled this afternoon." Serafina barely glanced at her. "Fine. Just don't damage them. They're worth more than you are." She turned back to her grapefruit, the matter already forgotten. An hour later, Alara was on a public bus, a heavy box of antique drapes on the seat beside her. The rumbling vehicle carried her away from the manicured lawns and oppressive silence of the Vanderbilt world and into the vibrant, chaotic heart of the city. For the first time, the anonymity of the bustling streets felt not like loneliness, but like freedom. Here she was not the charity case. She was no one, and in that nothingness, she could become anyone. Her first stop was not the cleaners. She found a small, grimy electronics shop and used the meager savings she had scraped together over the years, small tips from the rare compassionate guest coins found in discarded coat pockets, to purchase a cheap, untraceable burner phone. Her second stop was a public library where she used their photocopier to make a clean, clear copy of her parents' letter. She would not risk the original. Finally, she stood before a towering skyscraper of black glass and steel in the financial district. A discreet brass plaque near the entrance read, "Finch, Covington & Crowe." Swallowing her nerves, she walked through the revolving doors and into a lobby that was a symphony of hushed power. The air smelled of money and ambition. The receptionist, a woman with perfectly coiffed hair and a surgically attached telephone headset, looked up as Alara approached. Her gaze swept over Alara's simple dress and worn boots, and her expression frosted over with polite dismissal. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone implying that she very much doubted it. "I need to speak with Mr. Alistair Finch." Alara said, her voice steady. "It is a matter of the utmost urgency concerning the Ilarion Trust." She had gambled that the name forgotten by the world, but not by the legal custodians of the secret, would be her key. The receptionist's perfectly plucked eyebrow rose a fraction of an inch. She typed something into her computer, her expression shifting from dismissal to confusion, and then to a flicker of alarm. "One moment, please," she said, her voice suddenly losing its icy edge. She murmured into her headset, and a few minutes later, a young man in a sharp suit appeared to escort Ilara to the elevators. Alistair Finch's office was on the top floor with a panoramic view of the city that made the Vanderbilt estate seem like a child's plaything. The man himself was in his late 60s, with a mane of silver hair, sharp, intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and an aura of formidable calm. He had seen everything his posture seemed to say, and nothing could surprise him. "Miss," he began, gesturing for her to sit in the leather chair opposite his vast desk. "My name is Ilara," she said simply, "and I believe you have been waiting for me for a very long time." She placed the copy of her parents' letter and the photographs she had taken of the trust document on his desk. Finch picked up the letter first, his expression one of professional curiosity. As he read, the mask of imperturbable calm began to crack. His eyes widened slightly. He read the letter a second time, then a third, his gaze flicking up to study Ilara's face, truly seeing her for the first time. He then turned his attention to the photographs of the legal trust. He examined each image with the intense focus of a diamond cutter, his breathing shallow. The silence in the room stretched thick with the weight of 70 years of lies. When he finally looked up, all professional detachment was gone. His face was a mixture of profound shock and a slow-burning righteous fury. "My God," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "It's true. Augustus Vanderbilt, that magnificent thieving bastard." He leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant. "My grandfather was a junior partner here when this trust was established. He spoke of the Illyrians. He said it was the greatest tragedy and the greatest mystery he had ever encountered. He always suspected foul play." He leaned forward again, his gaze sharp and focused on Ilara. "Miss Illyrian," he said, the name sounding both strange and perfectly right. "You have been the victim of one of the most audacious acts of fraud I have ever witnessed. And I assure you, we will bring the full weight of this firm and the law down upon the heads of the Vanderbilt family." "I don't want to bring them down, Mr. Finch." Ilara said, her voice low and cold. "Not yet. I want them to dismantle themselves." Finch studied her, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. "A surgical strike," he murmured, understanding immediately. "Starve the beast before you slay it." "Very wise. A public lawsuit would give them time to hide assets, to shred documents, to spin a narrative. We must move from the shadows." For the next hour they planned. Finch, with his encyclopedic knowledge of the Vanderbilt's corporate structure, became her general. He confirmed that her legal authority as the true beneficiary was absolute, and now that she had come forward, immediately actionable. They pored over the corporate charts looking for a weak point of vulnerability. Here Finch set his finger, landing on a particular box in the complex diagram. Blackwood Vanderbilt Innovations, a joint venture. According to their latest filings, it's a high-risk project in emergent AI, heavily leveraged and burning through cash. It's being run by one Damian Blackwood. Ilara's jaw tightened. The project's primary funding, Finch continued, a grim smile playing on his lips, came from a single massive capital transfer from a Vanderbilt subsidiary 3 months ago. A transfer that, according to the Illyrian Trust's charter, would constitute a speculative investment, requiring the explicit written consent of the beneficiary. Consent, which was of course never obtained. It was the perfect target. It was isolated, financially volatile, and it would strike directly at Damian. "Freeze it," Ilara said, her voice devoid of hesitation. Finch nodded, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of the fight. He picked up his phone. He did not shout or threaten. His voice was a calm, precise instrument of legal destruction. He spoke to the head of the bank's corporate legal department, citing clause after clause, article after article, from the 70-year-old trust document. He never mentioned Ilara's name, referring only to his client, the sole and rightful beneficiary of the Illyrian Trust, who has now come forward to claim her rights. He requested an immediate and total freeze on all assets and accounts held by the subsidiary, pending a full and forensic audit for breach of fiduciary duty. The battle was over in less than 10 minutes. Ilara traveled back to the estate as the sun began to set, the city's lights beginning to glitter like a sea of scattered diamonds. She was the same girl who had left that morning in the same simple dress, but a fundamental transformation had occurred. The house, as she approached it up the long, winding drive, no longer looked like an imposing fortress. It looked like a target. She resumed her duties, a ghost in her own home. She helped serve the evening meal in the small family dining room. Serafina was absent out for the evening with friends. It was only Mr. Vanderbilt seated alone at the head of the long, polished table. He ate in a tense, brooding silence, his mood palpably dark. Then his phone rang, its sharp electronic trill cutting through the quiet. He answered it, his voice a low bark. "Damien, what is it now?" Ilara moved silently around the room, refilling his water glass. Her movement slow and deliberate, her hearing sharp. Mr. Vanderbilt's face contorted as he listened. "What do you mean, frozen?" He snarled into the phone, his voice a low, furious rumble. "The entire operating account. That's impossible. By whose authority?" He went silent again, listening, his knuckles turning white as he gripped his phone. Ilara placed a bread roll on his side plate, her hand as steady as a surgeon's. "Don't be an idiot," Mr. Vanderbilt hissed. "The bank's legal department wouldn't freeze a $90 million account on a whim. Who did they say authorized it?" "The Illyrian Trust." "What in God's name is that?" "That's an archaic charter. A historical footnote. That name hasn't meant anything in 70 years. Ilara picked up an empty dish and turned to leave the room. She kept her back to him, her expression a perfect placid mask of meek servitude. But inside, a cold, thrilling pulse of victory beat a triumphant rhythm. The first stone had been cast into the placid, corrupt waters of the Vanderbilt world. And the ripples were just beginning to spread. The days that followed Ilara's visit to the city were filled with a silence that was louder than any argument. It was a taut, suffocating quiet that permeated the Vanderbilt mansion, causing the staff to move with a new nervous tension and the family members to orbit each other like hostile planets. The news of the frozen account had not been a cannon blast, but a poison dart fired from an unknown location by an unseen assailant. The wound was invisible, but the venom was spreading rapidly through the veins of the Vanderbilt and Blackwood empires. Ilara watched it all from her position of calculated invisibility. She polished silver that reflected the strained faces of her tormentors. She served meals that were picked at in grim silence. She was the ghost at the feast, the silent witness to the slow, methodical unraveling she had set in motion. The power she now held was a heady, dangerous secret, a warm coal cupped in her hands while she feigned the chill of subservience. Damien was the first to break. He arrived at the estate 2 days after the incident, not in his usual sleek sports car that announced his presence with an arrogant roar, but in a nondescript black sedan driven by a chauffeur. His swagger was gone, replaced by a frantic energy that radiated from him in waves of barely suppressed rage. He stormed past the butler, ignoring the formal greeting, and went straight to Mr. Vanderbilt's office, the heavy oak door slamming shut behind him with a boom that echoed through the grand hall. Ilara was dusting the suits of armor that lined the corridor, her movement slow and deliberate, placing her just within earshot. The soundproofing was thick, but rage has a way of seeping through oak and plaster. Voices were raised, muffled, but sharp with fury. She could not make out the words, only the percussive, angry cadence of Damien's voice and the low, frustrated rumble of Mr. Vanderbilt's replies. The name Illyrian was a recurring guttural spike in the conversation, a ghost they were trying and failing to exorcise. When Damien finally emerged, his face was pale and tight with fury. His perfectly styled hair was slightly disheveled, as if he had been dragging his hands through it. He saw Ilara, and for a moment his eyes, usually so full of dismissive contempt, were completely blank, looking straight through her, as if she were made of glass. He was a predator who had been wounded by an unknown foe, and the confusion made him even more dangerous. He found Serafina on the West Terrace, where she was idly scrolling through her phone, feigning an air of detached boredom that did nothing to hide the new lines of anxiety around her eyes. "They know nothing," Damien bit out, pacing the length of the terrace like a caged panther. "Your father, the great titan of industry, has absolutely no idea who is doing this or how." Serafina placed her phone down, her expression one of petulant annoyance. "Damien, please. Lower your voice. The staff will hear." "The staff?" He let out a harsh, incredulous laugh. "That's what you're worried about. Our joint venture, a $90 million project, is paralyzed. My father is calling me every hour. Our investors are threatening to pull out. And you're worried about the damn staff." "It's a bank error," Serafina insisted, her voice taking on the stubborn, simplistic tone of someone who has never had to solve a real problem. "Daddy will fix it. He always does. This isn't one of your shopping mishaps, Serafina. This isn't a bank error." He stopped pacing and loomed over her, his voice dropping to a low, menacing hiss. This was a legal maneuver executed with surgical precision. They cited a trust, an ancient document your father claims is irrelevant. The Illyrian Trust. Does that name mean anything to you? Serafina frowned, a delicate, uncomprehending wrinkle appearing between her brows. Illyrian, no. It sounds like a brand of perfume. Why are you yelling at me? This has nothing to do with me. It has everything to do with you. Damien exploded, his control finally snapping. It's your family. Your history. What kind of skeletons are rattling around in your closets that you don't even know about? My family's name is tied to this project. My reputation is on the line because your father was too arrogant or too stupid to handle his own affairs. Alara, who had been tasked with trimming the ivy on the terrace wall, kept her back to them, the snip-snip of her shears, a quiet, rhythmic counterpoint to the escalating argument. Every word was a vindication. Every accusation a small victory. Serafina stood up, her face flushed with an unfamiliar mix of anger and fear. She was a princess in an ivory tower, and for the first time the tower was shaking. How dare you speak to me like that? My father built an empire. He is not stupid. Oh, really? Damien sneered, his handsome face twisting into an ugly mask. Then why is he powerless to stop this? Why is he holed up in his office like a frightened old man, unable to explain how a ghost from 70 years ago can suddenly seize control of his assets? All you know how to do is spend money and pose for photographers. This is the real world, Serafina. This is what happens when the pretty facade cracks. And let me tell you, your family's facade is cracking wide open. The cruelty of his words struck a different chord than his usual casual insults. This was not the playful condescension of a powerful man to his beautiful possession. This was the bitter lashing out of a cornered animal, and he was sinking his teeth into the person closest to him. Get out, Serafina whispered, her voice trembling. Get out of my house. Gladly, Damien spat. Call me when your father remembers how to be a king instead of a pawn in a game he doesn't even understand. He turned and stormed away, leaving Serafina standing alone on the vast, empty terrace, looking small and fragile against the backdrop of her immense inherited wealth. Ilara continued her work, her hands steady, her expression serene. She felt a grim, cold satisfaction watching their perfect, gilded relationship shatter on the rocks of the first real challenge it had ever faced. Their partnership was not built on love or respect, but on the mutual reinforcement of power and status. Now that those pillars were shaking, the structure was collapsing. But as she stole a glance at Serafina's shocked, bewildered face, another more complex emotion surfaced. It was a flicker of something that felt dangerously like pity. Serafina was cruel, yes, and vapid and entitled. But she was also a product of this corrupt, hollow world. She had been raised to be an ornament, her only value tied to her name and her beauty. She had never been taught strength or resilience or empathy. She was a beautiful, meticulously crafted doll, and someone had just knocked her off the shelf. Now, for the first time, she was seeing the floor rushing up to meet her, and she had no idea how to land. The rest of the week saw the cracks deepen and spread. The initial shockwave gave way to a series of debilitating aftershocks. The freeze on Blackwood Vanderbilt Innovations triggered a clause with their primary investors, who now demanded a full independent audit of the entire Vanderbilt Industries portfolio. The ghost of the Illyrian Trust, once a whispered, confused rumor, was becoming a terrifying legend in the city's financial circles. Who were they? Who was this anonymous beneficiary? And what would they do next? Serafina retreated into a self-imposed exile in her suite of rooms. Her laughter, which usually filled the halls, was gone. Ilara, delivering her meals on a silver tray, would find her staring blankly at a television screen or listlessly picking at her food. Her phone, usually a source of constant validation, had become an enemy. Ilara could hear the change in her one-sided conversations. The invitations were less frequent, the voices of her friends cooler, more cautious. The scent of trouble was on the Vanderbilt name, and in their world, trouble was a contagion to be avoided at all costs. One afternoon, Ilara found Serafina in the gallery, standing before a portrait of her mother, the late Eleanor Vanderbilt. It was a rare sight. Serafina seldom acknowledged the memory of the woman who had brought Ilara into their home. She was always so sad, Serafina said, not turning, as if speaking to the portrait itself. Ilara froze in the doorway, not sure if she was meant to hear, even when she smiled. I never understood why. She had everything. Alara remained silent. She thought of the key of the hidden letter of the numbers for the safe scrawled in Mrs. Vanderbilt's hand. She had had everything Alara thought except the freedom to undo the terrible wrong her husband had committed. She had lived and died with the weight of their secret. "Why is this happening?" Serafina asked, finally turning to look at Alara. Her eyes were wide with a genuine helpless confusion that was almost childlike. "What did we do?" For a single wild moment Alara was tempted to tell her, to lay the entire ugly truth at her feet. "Your father is a thief. Your home is a lie. Your life is built on my inheritance." But she held her tongue. The time was not right. The lesson was not yet complete. Serafina was not asking for the truth. She was asking for a return to the comfortable ignorance she had always known. "I don't know, Miss Vanderbilt," Alara said, her voice a perfect imitation of meek subservience. She dipped her head and retreated from the room, leaving the heiress alone with the ghost of her mother and the crumbling ruins of her perfect world. Later that evening, Alara slipped out into the garden as dusk settled, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and soft rose. The air was cool and smelled of night-blooming jasmine. She found Liam by the koi pond, not working, but simply sitting on the stone bench watching the burnished golden-white fish glide like living jewels through the dark water. He looked up as she approached, a small smile touching his lips. He didn't ask about the tension in the house, about the arguments or the silent meals. He didn't have to. His calm, steady presence was an acknowledgement of the storm and a quiet offer of shelter from it. He simply patted the space on the bench beside him. Alara sat down, and for a long time they said nothing, watching the last of the light fade from the sky. The house loomed behind them, its windows glowing like the eyes of a great wounded beast. Alara reached into her pocket, and her fingers closed around the Illyrian key. The cracks in the facade were showing. The foundations were groaning. And soon, very soon, she would choose the next place to apply pressure until the whole house of cards came tumbling down. The pressure within the Vanderbilt mansion had begun to change. The initial shock had curdled into a thick, paranoid atmosphere. Mr. Vanderbilt spent his days in a flurry of hushed, angry phone calls, his lawyers coming and going like carrion birds sensing a feast. Serafina remained a ghost in her own home, her bewildered fear slowly hardening into a brittle defensive anger directed at anyone who crossed her path. Damien had not returned, and his absence was a gaping wound in the family's social armor. Alara felt the shift keenly. She was the epicenter of a storm that only she and a select few lawyers knew she was controlling. The weight of her secret, once a source of strength, was now becoming a profound isolation. She was a general with an army of one, and the silence of her solitary war was deafening. Mr. Finch's daily encrypted updates on her burner phone were her only contact with the outside world, clinical reports of legal maneuvers and financial tracking that felt detached from the raw human drama unfolding before her eyes. She needed to talk to someone, not a lawyer bound by professional duty, but a person who could understand the landscape of her gilded cage. Her thoughts again and again returned to the quiet gardener with the intelligent eyes and the knowledge of forgotten history. Liam. He was the only person in this entire estate who had ever looked at her and seen a human being. She found him in the late afternoon, far from the manicured perfection of the main gardens, in a place few people ever visited, the old, dilapidated greenhouse. It stood at the edge of the woods that bordered the property, a skeletal structure of rusted iron and clouded, grimy glass. Most of its panes were broken, and nature was slowly reclaiming the interior, with ivy creeping through the fractured walls and wildflowers sprouting from the cracked flagstone floor. He was inside, not working, but standing near a long rotted potting bench, staring at a single defiant rosebush that had somehow survived years of neglect. It had produced one perfect pale yellow bloom. He did not seem surprised to see her, as if he had been waiting. "They call this one the peace rose," he said, his voice soft in the still green-scented air. It was cultivated in France during the Second World War, smuggled out of the country just before the invasion, a symbol of hope in a dark time. Alara stopped beside him, her gaze on the flawless flower. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It is," he agreed, "and resilient. It looks delicate, but its roots are strong enough to break through stone if they have to." He turned to face her, his hazel eyes serious. The gardener persona, the simple deferential air he wore like a protective cloak, seemed to fall away. In its place was a focused intensity, a shrewd intelligence that was both startling and familiar. "You've been busy, Alara," he said. It was not a question. Her heart gave a jolt. I don't know what you mean. Don't you? A small, sad smile touched his lips. The Illyrian Trust. A $90 million account frozen. The great Augustus Vanderbilt's legacy suddenly under scrutiny. A ghost has come to haunt this house, and I think I'm looking at her. Alara felt the blood drain from her face. She took an involuntary step back, her carefully constructed composure crumbling. How could you possibly know that? Because I've been hunting for that same ghost for the last 2 years, he said, his voice low and imbued with a sudden hard anger. He gestured to the cracked flagstones. Please, we should talk. And I believe we are owed the truth. Both of us. He led her to a worn stone bench in the corner of the greenhouse, the only spot still clear of encroaching nature. Alara sat, her mind reeling. He knew. He knew everything. Was he a threat? An agent of the Vanderbilt sent to trap her? As if reading her mind, he said, I am not your enemy, Alara. In fact, I may be the only true ally you have in this place. He paused, taking a deep breath. My name is not Liam. That's my middle name. My full name is Liam Sterling. The name landed with the force of a physical blow. Sterling. As in Sterling Technologies, Vanderbilt Industries' most significant and bitter rival. The two companies had been locked in a corporate war for decades, a rivalry that was the stuff of legends in the financial world. You're a Sterling. She breathed the words, feeling alien in her mouth. You're the heir to Sterling Tech. What are you doing here working as a gardener? Gathering information, he set, his eyes hard. And seeking a measure of justice that has been denied my family for 3 generations. The story you just uncovered, the story of the Illyrians, is also the story of the Sterlings. The two are intertwined, bound together by the greed of one man, Augustus Vanderbilt. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped. My great-grandfather, Jonathan Sterling, was not just a business rival of Augustus Vanderbilt's. They were partners once, best friends. My great-grandfather was the innovator, the engineering genius. Augustus was the financier, the ruthless businessman. Together, they were poised to build an empire. But Jonathan needed more capital to fund his research, and Augustus knew where to get it. Alara's breath hitched. The Illyrians. Liam nodded grimly. Your parents, Richard and Liana Illyrian, were brilliant. They had already amassed a fortune from their own patents. They trusted Augustus, and they invested everything with him, creating the very trust that you have discovered. That massive, sudden influx of Illyrian capital changed everything. Augustus no longer needed my great-grandfather. Armed with near-limitless funds, he staged a hostile takeover, using deceptive legal tactics and corporate espionage to seize control of Jonathan's patents, bankrupt his company, and leave him with nothing. The foundation of Vanderbilt Industries' entire tech division was built on my family's stolen intellectual property, paid for with your family's stolen money. The scale of the deception was staggering. It was not just one act of betrayal, but a cascade of them, a dynasty founded on the ruins of 2 others. My family never recovered. Liam continued, his voice tight with an inherited pain. The legal battles drained what little they had left. My great-grandfather died a broken man. The official story, the one written by the victor, was that he was a poor businessman who was outmaneuvered. The truth is that he was robbed. For years, my family has been trying to find proof, something to reclaim our name and our legacy. That search led me to the root of the Vanderbilt's power, the mysterious, unassailable Illyrian Trust. He finally looked at her, his eyes full of a shared understanding. I spent years digging. I found whispers of the trust in old financial records, mentions of its secret beneficiary. I found your name, Alara Illyrian, the lost heir, but the trail went cold. There was no record of you anywhere. I began to suspect the Vanderbilts had hidden you. So I came here under a false name to the one place where the truth had to be buried. I took a job as a gardener to get inside, to watch, to listen. And then I found you, he said softly. A young woman with your intelligence, your grace, your quiet strength. Being treated like a scullery maid. Wearing the face of a servant when you should have been the mistress of the house. I knew from the first moment I saw you that you were the one I was looking for. Alara was speechless, overwhelmed by the torrent of revelations. Why didn't you tell me, she finally managed to ask. Why let me live like that if you knew? His expression was filled with a profound, almost pained respect. Because it was not my truth to give you, Alara. It was your birthright to discover. I could have handed you the documents, but I could not hand you the strength to use them. I saw what was inside you, the resilience, the fire. I watched you endure their cruelty with a dignity they could never comprehend. I had to wait for you to find the key. I had to wait for you to become the woman who could not just open the lock, but who could face what was on the other side. And you did. The validation in his words was a balm on her wounded soul. He had not seen her as a victim to be rescued, but as a queen waiting for the right moment to claim her throne. He had trusted her strength before she had even trusted it herself. My investigation is separate from yours. He went on, his tone shifting from personal to strategic. I've been gathering evidence of Marcus Vanderbilt's current crimes. Insider trading, shell corporations, tax evasion. He's as corrupt as his grandfather, just less subtle. My goal was to expose him and in doing so force a re-examination of the company's origins, which would lead back to my family's stolen patents. He held out his hand not to touch her, but as an offering, an invitation. But now everything has changed. You have the ultimate claim, the legal standing that supersedes everything. My family is seeking justice for our stolen legacy. You are seeking justice for your stolen life. Our goals are not just aligned, they are one and the same. The offer hung in the air between them, shimmering with possibility. I am not here to take over your fight, he said with fierce sincerity. I am here to offer an alliance. My firm's legal team, the best forensic accountants in the country. My company's resources are all at your disposal. You have the claim. I can provide the army to enforce it. Together we can burn their corrupt world to the ground and build something better on the ashes. The feeling that washed over Ilara was so powerful, it almost brought her to her knees. It was the feeling of not being alone. For the first time in her life, she had a partner, an ally. Someone who saw her, understood her, and was willing to stand beside her in the fire. Their friendship, forged in quiet moments and shared glances, had been transformed into something deeper, more powerful. It was a partnership of minds and missions, a bond sealed by a shared history of injustice. And beneath it all, a current of something else. Something personal and electric flowed between them. She finally reached out and her fingers brushed against his. His hand closed around hers, his grip warm and strong. It was not the hand of a gardener, but the hand of a partner, an equal. An alliance, she said, her voice clear and strong, a promise spoken aloud in the forgotten greenhouse. Yes. They stood up and walked to the grimy glass wall, looking out at the magnificent, imposing structure of the Vanderbilt mansion in the distance. It stood proud against the evening sky, a monument to greed and lies. But it no longer looked invincible. It looked fragile, like a house of glass. And they together were holding the stone. The annual Vanderbilt Foundation Charity Gala was less a celebration of philanthropy and more a raw display of power. It was the glittering apex of the social season, an event where fortunes were consolidated, alliances were forged, and reputations were made or broken under the light of 1,000 crystals. This year, however, it was something more, a desperate gamble. For Marcus Vanderbilt, the gala was a fortress wall, a final defiant projection of stability and untouchable prestige, designed to quell the ugly rumors that had been circling his empire like vultures. He was a king under siege, and this party was his last stand. The tension in the mansion in the week leading up to the event was a palpable living thing. An army of florists, caterers, and event planners swarmed the grounds, their frantic energy a stark contrast to the grim, brittle silence of the family itself. Mr. Vanderbilt was a thundercloud in a tuxedo, barking orders and reviewing guest lists with a feverish intensity. Serafina, thinner and sharper edged than before, threw herself into the preparations with a desperate ferocity, as if the perfect shade of champagne rose or the precise arrangement of ice sculptures could somehow mend the deep spreading cracks in her world. She was a general arranging deck chairs on a sinking ship. On the evening of the gala, in a penthouse suite at the Four Seasons Hotel overlooking the city, a different kind of preparation was underway. The suite secured by Liam was a world of quiet, focused calm. Ilara stood before a floor-to-ceiling mirror, a stranger looking back at her. The simple, severe lines of her servant's uniform were gone, replaced by a gown of deep sapphire silk that seemed to drink the light. It was simple, elegant, and devastatingly expensive. Its clean lines did not hide her, but rather showcased the strength in her posture that a decade of subservience had failed to break. Around her neck, on a delicate platinum chain, rested a single magnificent diamond. "It was your mother's," Liam said, his voice soft from behind her. He stood in the doorway, already dressed in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, his presence a solid, comforting anchor. My investigators found it in a private vault in Geneva, registered under her name. It was the only piece of jewelry she didn't place in the trust. I think she wanted you to have something that was just from her. Alara raised a hand to the diamond. It was cool against her skin, a spark of ice and fire. She looked at her reflection, truly looked past the gown and the jewel. The frightened, invisible girl from the attic was gone. In her place was a woman with eyes that held the cool, calculating calm of a strategist and the burning fire of an Illyrian. She was ready. "Is it time?" she asked, her voice clear and steady. Liam nodded. The legal team just confirmed. The emergency injunction was filed with the Supreme Court 10 minutes ago. It was approved and executed. The notification of the immediate transfer of control of all assets of the Illyrian Trust to its sole beneficiary, Alara Illyrian, was delivered to Marcus Vanderbilt's personal tablet 5 minutes ago. He paused, a grim smile touching his lips. "Welcome to your kingdom, Alara." Back at the Vanderbilt mansion, the first wave of guests had arrived. The ballroom was once again a sea of glittering jewels and polite, predatory smiles. Marcus Vanderbilt stood at the top of the grand staircase, Seraphina at his side, playing the part of the gracious, unassailable host. He was shaking a senator's hand when a pale, sweating junior associate from his legal firm rushed to his side and discreetly handed him a tablet. "Sir, you need to see this. It's urgent." Marcus's smile tightened. He excused himself and glanced at the screen. Alara, watching from a hidden service corridor where she was supposed to be supervising the champagne distribution one last time, saw the sequence of emotions play out on his face like a rapid, violent storm. First confusion as his eyes scanned the legal jargon, then a dawning, horrified disbelief. Finally, the color drained from his face, leaving behind a gray, ashen mask of pure, impotent rage. He gripped the tablet so hard his knuckles turned white. He had been checkmated. He was standing in a ballroom full of the most powerful people in the country, and he had just learned that he was no longer the king of his own castle. He was a trespasser. It was at that precise moment that the majordomo's voice boomed from the entrance hall, cutting through the polite hum of conversation, announcing Mr. Liam Sterling and Miss Alara Illyrian. A tidal wave of silence washed over the ballroom. Every head turned, every conversation stopped. The collective silent gasp was a physical force. The sight at the top of the stairs was so shocking, so utterly paradigm-shattering, that for a moment no one could process what they were seeing. There was Liam Sterling, the brilliant, reclusive heir to their greatest rival, looking impossibly handsome and radiating an aura of absolute power. And on his arm was not one of the city's established socialites, but the girl, the orphan. The Vanderbilt's little charity case, a face many recognized from the periphery of parties like this one, always in the background, always serving. But she was not the servant girl tonight. The woman who descended the grand staircase on Liam Sterling's arm was a revelation. The sapphire gown flowed around her like liquid night, the Illyrian diamond at her throat glittered with a cold, regal fire. Her head was held high, her expression composed and unreadable, her eyes sweeping over the stunned crowd with a calm authority that was more commanding than any shout. The transformation was so absolute, so complete, that it was terrifying. They reached the bottom of the stairs, a silent, powerful vortex in the suddenly still room. Marcus Vanderbilt, his face a mask of apoplectic fury, strode toward them. Seraphina trailing in his wake, her face a pale picture of confusion. "What is the meaning of this?" Marcus snarled, his voice a low, shaking growl. He glared at Alara. "Take off that dress and get back to the kitchens. Who in God's name do you think you are?" Alara met his gaze without flinching. Her voice when she spoke was not loud, but it carried across the silent ballroom with the clarity of a ringing bell. "I know exactly who I am, Marcus," she said, using his first name for the first time in her life. The casual impertinence of it was a slap in the face. "I am Alara Illyrian, and as of 17 minutes ago I am the owner of this house, this company, and everything in it. You are the one who should be asking who you are, because as of right now, you are merely a guest." The collective intake of breath from the surrounding crowd was sharp and audible. Seraphina stared at Alara, her perfectly painted lips parted in a silent O of disbelief. Her mind, unable to process the impossible, simply refused to understand. Beside her, Damian Blackwood, who had been trying to project an air of nonchalant confidence all evening, felt a cold dread snake up his spine. The Illyrian Trust, the girl he had tormented for years. The impossible was suddenly horribly real. The memory of her standing amidst the shattered champagne flutes, the way he had sneered at her, calling her gutter trash. The humiliation was so absolute it was nauseating. He had not been kicking a stray dog. He had been spitting on a slumbering dragon. Mr. Vanderbilt looked as if he had been physically struck. "You lie," he hissed. "This is a trick. A corporate stunt by the Sterlings." "It is no trick," Liam said, his voice cold and sharp as steel. "It is a correction. A 70-year-old debt has just come due." But Alara was no longer paying attention to them. Her purpose tonight was not to engage in a shouting match with the defeated. It was to consolidate her power. With Liam at her side, she turned away from the sputtering frozen Vanderbilts and moved gracefully into the heart of the ballroom. Her first target was Mr. Harrison, the investor whose wife's Dior gown she had ruined weeks before. He was a key board member of Vanderbilt Industries. He looked at her approach with utter bewilderment. "Mr. Harrison," Alara said, her smile polite but devoid of warmth. "I am Alara Illyrian. As the new majority shareholder and chairman of the board, I look forward to reviewing our company's future direction with you at your earliest convenience." Harrison's jaw dropped. He could only stammer a reply as Alara and Liam moved on. Their next stop was a circle of powerful bankers who held the company's primary lines of credit. "Gentlemen," Liam said smoothly, his arm securely around Alara's waist, "I'm sure you've heard the news. Sterling Technologies and the Illyrian estate will be entering a new era of collaboration. We're planning a full corporate restructuring of Vanderbilt Industries focusing on transparency and ethical governance. We trust we'll have your support." Each conversation was a precisely aimed detonation. The news spread through the room like a contagion, whispered from guest to guest. The orphan is the heiress. The entire Vanderbilt fortune is a fraud. Sterling and the Illyrian girl are in control. Alliances that had stood for decades evaporated in minutes. The people who had been clustered around Marcus Vanderbilt seeking his favor now avoided his gaze, melting away into the crowd. He was left standing alone in the middle of his own ballroom, a king suddenly stripped of his crown, his army and his kingdom watching as his empire was carved up before his very eyes. Alara finally stopped at the center of the room, the new undisputed locus of power. The most influential people in the city were now gravitating towards her, their expressions a mixture of awe, fear, and opportunistic curiosity. Across the vast crowded space, her eyes met Serafina's. Serafina had not moved. She stood frozen, a statue of emerald silk and shattered illusion. The confusion had finally cleared from her face, replaced by the dawning, soul-crushing horror of complete and total understanding. She was looking at the girl she had allowed to be humiliated, the girl she had considered less than human, and she was seeing a queen. In that moment, Serafina Vanderbilt understood that she had lost everything, not just the money and the status, but the very reality she had been born into. She was no longer the princess of the ball. In her own home, she had become the ghost. The power had not just shifted, it had been reclaimed. The Vanderbilt gala did not end. It fractured. The moment Alara's claim was made, a shockwave of scandal radiated through the ballroom, shattering the fragile illusion of high society. The polite hum of conversation devolved into a frantic, feverish exchange of whispers. Guests who had arrived eager to curry favor with a king now scrambled to distance themselves from a leper. They fled not in a panicked stampede, but with the practiced, bloodless efficiency of their class, a series of quiet apologies, sudden departures, and furtive glances, leaving the Vanderbilts to stand alone in the wreckage of their own party. By the time the last limousine had crunched its way down the gravel drive, a new pack of wolves had arrived. News vans, their satellite dishes like skeletal fingers pointing at the sky, lined the grand gates of the estate. The scandal was no longer a secret. It was a feeding frenzy. The downfall, when it came, was not a slow decline, but a catastrophic collapse. The legal and financial machinery that Alara and Liam had set in motion was ruthlessly efficient. While Marcus Vanderbilt had spent his life building a fortress of wealth and influence, he had built it on a foundation of sand, the Illyrian Trust, and Alara now commanded the tide. The following morning, Marcus Vanderbilt sat in the cavernous library, the same room where Alara had discovered the truth, a ghost in his own home. He had not slept. His tuxedo was rumpled, his face a gray mask of sleepless disbelief. He was a man hollowed out by the sudden violent theft of his reality. When Alistair Finch arrived, flanked by 2 junior partners and a team of forensic accountants. There was no argument, no blustering rage. The fight had gone out of Marcus. The authorities have been notified. Marcus Finch said, his voice devoid of triumph, holding only the cold, hard finality of the law. He placed a thick stack of documents on the mahogany desk. An indictment has been issued. Fraudulent management of a trust embezzlement securities fraud. The list is extensive. Liam Sterling's investigators have also provided the SEC with a comprehensive file on your insider trading activities. Finch gestured to the accountants, who immediately began to methodically work their way through the bookshelves which held not only books, but decades of hidden ledgers. We are taking control of all personal and corporate records. Your assets have been frozen pending the outcome of the criminal investigation. You will be escorted from the premises within the hour. Marcus did not look at the papers. He stared at the portrait of his grandfather Augustus, as if seeking an answer from the painted eyes. The patriarch's confident gaze now seemed like a cruel joke. He had inherited a stolen kingdom and ruled it with arrogant pride, never once considering that the rightful heir might one day come to collect. His downfall was public and brutal. News channels played footage of him being quietly escorted from his office at Vanderbilt Industries. Later that day, his face impassive, his powerful stride reduced to a defeated shuffle. The titan of industry had become a common criminal. His legacy not one of power, but of the most profound and audacious theft. Damian Blackwood's fate was swifter and in some ways more humiliating. He was not afforded the tragic dignity of a public arrest. He was simply erased. He arrived at the estate gates that morning, demanding to see Serafina, to see Marcus, to understand the scope of the disaster. He was met not by the familiar deferential guards, but by a new implacable security team hired by Sterling. "Mr. Blackwood, your name is not on the access list," the guard said, his voice flat and unimpressed. "Not on the list," Damian sputtered, his face flushing with rage. "I am Damian Blackwood. I practically live here. My orders come from the new owner of the estate," the guard replied. "Miss Alarian, and she has specified that you are not welcome on these grounds." The name spoken by a stranger was a gut punch. He spent the next hour making frantic calls, but his world was shrinking with every unanswered ring. His investors, having seen the news, were not just pulling out. They were suing him for misrepresentation. He was a pariah. The final blow came not from Alara, but from his own blood. His father, a man who valued strength and reputation above all else, summoned him to the Blackwood banking headquarters. It was not a conversation. It was an execution. "You are a fool, Damian," his father said, his voice like chipping ice. "You allowed yourself to be bewitched by a name, a pretty face, and you never once did your due diligence. You tied the Blackwood reputation to a house of cards. You let a servant girl, an orphan, outmaneuver you and make a public spectacle of your incompetence." "Father, I didn't know." "Knowing is your job," his father roared, slamming a hand on his desk. "You are no longer of use to this family. Your credit lines are cut. Your access to the family accounts is revoked. You are removed from the board. You are on your own. Do not come back here." Damian stumbled out of the building into the harsh afternoon sun, a prince suddenly turned into a pauper. He had lost not just his money, but the only thing that had ever given him an identity, his name. For Serafina, the downfall was a quieter, more agonizing process. It was the death of 1,000 cuts. She awoke on the morning after the gala to an unnervingly silent house. The familiar army of staff, the maids, the cooks, the butlers who had catered to her every whim since birth was gone. In their place was a small, unfamiliar crew who moved with a quiet efficiency and looked at her with polite, indifferent eyes. They were not her servants. They belonged to the new regime. She tried to go shopping a familiar balm for any emotional distress, only to have her platinum card declined at Dior with a quiet final beep of rejection. She called her friends her so-called best friends, the girls with whom she had shared 1,000 secrets and champagnes. Their voices were strained, their excuses flimsy. They were busy. They were traveling. They would call her back. They never did. She wandered the vast, silent rooms of the mansion, a princess lost in her own empty castle. The priceless art and antique furniture she had grown up with, things she had taken for granted as parts of the scenery, were now being catalogued by strangers with clipboards. Movers began to arrive, carefully packing away objects into wooden crates. Her life was being dismantled piece by piece right before her eyes. The house was no longer a home. It was an asset being liquidated. While her family's world imploded, Alara was building a new one. She did not move into the master suite of the mansion. Instead, she claimed the library as her headquarters. It was a symbolic choice. She would rule from the room where she had discovered the truth. With Liam by her side and teams of lawyers and accountants working around the clock, she began the monumental task of untangling the 70-year knot of the Vanderbilt fraud. She was not a gloating victor. The work was grim, the responsibility immense. Each document she signed, each order she gave had real-world consequences. She authorized the severance packages for the household staff she'd known her whole life, ensuring they were treated fairly. She reviewed the corporate structure of Vanderbilt Industries, her mind sharp and focused, identifying the rot and planning the cure. Liam was her constant shadow, her partner in every sense of the word. He challenged her, supported her, and translated the complex world of corporate governance into a language she could command. They worked late into the night, fueled by coffee and a shared sense of purpose. In the midst of the chaos of their hostile takeover, they were building a foundation of trust and a deep unspoken affection. One evening, as she signed the final document that authorized the transfer of evidence to the district attorney's office, the document that would ensure Marcus Vanderbilt's conviction, her hand paused. Liam, sensing her hesitation, placed his hand over hers. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. She looked up at him, the weight of her actions settling on her. "He raised me, Liam. He was cruel and he was a thief, but he was the only father I ever knew. Is it wrong that some part of me feels sad?" "No, Alara," he said, his voice full of a gentle wisdom. "It's not wrong. It means that after everything they did to you, they couldn't kill your humanity. That's why you'll be a better leader than they ever were." His words gave her the strength to finish her signature. The deed was done. Later that night, Alara was walking through the now barren gallery, the walls covered in pale rectangles where paintings had once hung. A single figure was standing in the darkness, silhouetted against the moonlight streaming through the large bay window. It was Serafina. She was wearing a simple silk robe, her hair undone, her face pale, and stripped of all its artifice and arrogance. She looked like what she was, a lost girl in a house that no longer recognized her. She turned as Alara approached, her eyes holding a mixture of fear, hatred, and a desperate pleading confusion. All the fire was gone. All the cruel confidence had been burned away. She was nothing. "They took my father away this afternoon." Serafina said, her voice a hollow whisper. "The movers are coming for the rest of the furniture tomorrow. Damien's family has disowned him. Everything is gone." She looked at Alara, her former servant, her lifelong shadow, who now held the power of life and death over her. "What are you going to do with me?" The question hung in the vast empty room, a final desperate plea from the ruins of a fallen dynasty. The moonlight pooling on the gallery floor was merciless, illuminating the vast emptiness of the room, and the two figures who stood within it like statues from a forgotten age. Serafina's question, raw and stripped of all its former arrogance, hung in the cold, still air between them. "What are you going to do with me?" For a long, silent moment, Alara did not answer. She let the question settle, let its full weight be felt. In that moment, a decade of stored-up grievances rose within her, a bitter, intoxicating tide. She had the power to give the answer. Serafina deserved the answer that the cruel, indifferent princess of the Vanderbilt dynasty had earned 1,000 times over. She could cast her out with nothing but the clothes on her back to let her taste the cold terror of a world without a safety net. She could let her discover what it felt like to be judged, dismissed, and deemed worthless based on circumstance. She could give her a perfect, symmetrical revenge, an eye for an eye, a life of privilege for a life of poverty. The temptation was a physical thing, a visceral, satisfying heat that spread through her chest. She remembered every slight, every casual cruelty, every moment she was made to feel less than human, and the darkest part of her soul whispered, "It's your turn. Make her pay." She looked at the young woman before her. The fight had gone out of Serafina completely. Her shoulders were slumped, her hands twisted together in a gesture of pure, desperate anxiety. The mask of perfect, bored beauty had shattered, and beneath it was only a terrifying, hollow emptiness. "What do you think I should do with you, Serafina?" Alara finally asked, her voice quiet, clinical, and devoid of the pity or rage Serafina might have expected. Serafina flinched, as if the quiet tone were a physical blow. I don't know," she stammered, Her eyes darted around the empty room as if looking for an escape for some familiar landmark in this terrifying new landscape of her life. I'll do anything. I'll apologize. Apologize. A small, humorless smile touched Alara's lips. For what specifically, I want to hear you say it. This was the first test. An apology was easy. An admission was not. Serafina's jaw worked, her mind clearly struggling to grasp a concept as foreign as genuine accountability. For not being nicer to you, she began, her voice weak. For letting Damien? For the things he said. Letting him. Alara took a step closer, her voice hardening almost imperceptibly. No, Serafina. You didn't just let him. You stood beside him. You watched. I looked at you that night at the gala after he called me gutter trash in front of 200 people. I begged you with my eyes to show one flicker of human decency. Do you know what I saw in your face? Not pity, not even conflict. I saw annoyance. Annoyance that my clumsiness was ruining your perfect party. Each word was a precise surgical cut dissecting the layers of self-deception Serafina had wrapped herself in for years. No, Serafina whispered, shaking her head in denial. It wasn't like that, wasn't it? Alara pressed on, her voice relentless. Do you remember the winter you received a pony for your birthday and I received a new pair of socks, and you laughed, telling your friends it was important to give the orphans practical gifts? Do you remember the time you accidentally spilled ink on the only photograph I had of my parents, the one your mother had given me? You didn't apologize then either. You just sighed and said I shouldn't leave my sentimental clutter lying around. She was not shouting. Her voice was a low, steady current of ice and fire, and it was far more terrifying than any scream. She was holding up a mirror to Serafina's soul, forcing her to look at the ugly, distorted reflection she had spent her life ignoring. Serafina's face crumpled. The denial shattered, and something raw and agonizing broke through. A sob tore from her throat, a sound of such profound, unpracticed despair that it seemed to echo in the empty gallery. I was jealous, she cried out, the words ripped from her. I was always jealous of you. Alara stopped, genuinely shocked. Jealous. The idea was so absurd, so utterly nonsensical, it threw her off balance. Jealous of what? My attic room. My threadbare clothes. My loneliness. Of you? Serafina choked out between sobs, her perfect facade finally collapsing into a mess of tears and incoherent grief. You had nothing, and yet you had something. Something I never understood. You had a quietness, a strength. You read books. You could be alone. You didn't need an audience to feel real. She sank to the floor, her silk robe pooling around her like a puddle of moonlight. My entire life has been a performance. I had to be the perfect daughter, the perfect socialite, the perfect Vanderbilt. Every smile, every friendship, every choice was calculated for its effect. I didn't know how to be anything else. And then there you were, the ghost in the house with your sad, knowing eyes. You never asked for anything. You never needed anything from anyone. And I hated you for it. I hated you because you were free in your prison while I was a prisoner in my palace. She looked up at Alara, her face streaked with tears, her eyes stripped bare of all pretense. When Damien was cruel to you, it made me feel powerful. It was the only way I knew how to feel powerful. Because next to you, I always felt weak, hollow. I am so sorry, Alara. Not because I lost everything, but because I was a part of why you had nothing. The confession, so raw and unexpected, extinguished the last embers of Alara's desire for revenge. To crush the weeping, broken girl at her feet would be a hollow, meaningless victory. It would not heal her past, and it would only serve to prove that she had learned nothing from it. To perpetuate the cycle of cruelty would be to become a Vanderbilt in spirit, if not in name, and she was an Ilarian. She looked at Serafina, and for the first time she saw her not as a villain, but as a casualty, another victim of the gilded cage her father had built. She felt a profound, aching sadness for the girl who had been taught that power came from humiliating others, the girl who had everything and valued nothing. Alara took a deep breath, the cold, clean air of decision filling her lungs. She had found her own strength, not in reclaiming her fortune, but in surviving without it. True mercy was not forgiveness. It was offering someone the chance to find their own strength, however painful the process might be. Get up, Serafina, she said, her voice gentle now but firm. Serafina slowly, unsteadily rose to her feet. I am going to give you a choice. Alara said, her tone becoming businesslike, stripping the raw emotion from the room. It is the first real choice I suspect you have ever had to make for yourself. You have two paths. She held up one finger. Path 1. I will establish an anonymous trust for you. It will not be a fortune, but it will be enough. Enough to buy a small house in a town where no one has ever heard the name Vanderbilt. Enough to live a quiet, comfortable, and completely unremarkable life. You can change your name, disappear, and never have to face the consequences of what our family has done. You can choose to be forgotten. Then, she held up a second finger. Path 2. You will be given nothing. No money, no name to hide behind. Tomorrow morning, you will report to the Human Resources Department of the Illyrian Sterling Corporation. They will have an application waiting for you for an entry-level position in the mailroom. The salary will be meager. The work will be tedious. You will live in a small apartment that you will have to pay for yourself. You will be expected to work your way up if you have it in you from the absolute bottom. You will have to earn your own money, your own self-respect, and your own future. She let the two options hang in the air, stark and uncompromising. One path offers you escape, Alara said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. The other offers you the chance, however slim, at redemption. It is the chance to become someone other than the person you were raised to be. She held Serafina's terrified, searching gaze for a final moment. The choice is yours, and yours alone. Let me know what you decide in the morning. Without another word, Alara turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing in the vast, empty gallery. She left Serafina standing alone in the pale moonlight, suspended between two impossible futures, finally forced to confront the only question that had ever truly mattered. Who was she really when there was no one left to perform for? The sun rose on a world irrevocably changed. Alara stood by the tall library window, watching the morning light spill across the manicured lawns of her estate. She had not slept, but she was not tired. She was waiting. The entire house seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the resolution of the final personal piece of the puzzle, Serafina. Just as the grandfather clock in the hall chimed 8, the library doors opened. Serafina stood in the doorway. She was not wearing a silk robe, but a simple pair of gray trousers and a plain white blouse, clothes that had clearly been purchased from a department store, not a boutique. They were the clothes of an ordinary person. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her face was scrubbed clean of makeup. She looked younger and profoundly vulnerable, but for the first time there was a flicker of steel in her eyes. She did not look at Alara immediately. Instead, her gaze traveled around the room, the tomb of her family's legacy, as if seeing it for the first time. I spent my whole life in this house, she said, her voice quiet but clear, and I never once came into this room just to read a book. She finally met Alara's eyes. I was an ornament. Something to be looked at. I think I'm tired of being looked at. She took a deep breath, a person standing on the edge of a cliff about to leap. I'll take the job, she said. I don't want to disappear. I don't want to be forgotten. I want to learn how to be someone, even if it means starting in the mailroom. Alara felt a slow, surprising wave of admiration. In her moment of total defeat, Serafina had not chosen the easy path of escape. She had chosen the brutal, uncertain path of rebuilding. It was the first truly brave thing Alara had ever seen her do. Report to the Illyrian Sterling Tower at 9 tomorrow morning, Alara said, her tone professional, granting Serafina the dignity of a new beginning. Human Resources will have your paperwork. Your supervisor's name is Mrs. Gable. She is exacting. You will be expected to work hard. I understand, Serafina said. She gave a small, stiff nod, turned, and walked out of the room, leaving the ghost of Serafina Vanderbilt behind her, and taking the first tentative steps as simply Serafina. With that final thread tied, the old world was well and truly gone. The fates of the other architects of her pain were sealed by the cold, impartial hand of the law. Marcus Vanderbilt was convicted in a swift, high-profile trial, his name now a permanent stain in the annals of corporate crime. He would spend the rest of his days in a federal prison, a king confined to a 6-by-9-foot cell, haunted by the ghost of a friendship he had betrayed, and a fortune he had only ever been a steward of. Damian Blackwood, cut off from his family's wealth and protection, was consumed by the lawsuits from his ruined investors. He became a footnote in the society pages, a cautionary tale of arrogance and hubris, eventually disappearing into an obscurity more complete and damning than any prison sentence. He had built his identity on a foundation of power over others, and when that power was gone, he simply ceased to exist. 1 year later, the world looked very different. The towering skyscraper that once bore the Vanderbilt name was now the Illyrian Sterling Tower. Inside, the corporate culture had been transformed from the ground up. In a sunlit boardroom, Alara and Liam presented their quarterly report to a new ethically minded board. Phase 2 of the Illyrian Sterling Initiative will focus on creating a subsidized tech incubator for low-income startups. Alara announced, her voice resonating with a quiet, unshakable confidence. Our goal is not simply to maximize profit, but to democratize innovation. We believe the next great idea is just as likely to come from a garage in the inner city as a lab in Silicon Valley. Liam, standing beside her, added, "Our forensic accounting team has also successfully recovered another $50 million in offshore assets hidden by the previous administration. As per Miss Illyrian's directive, these funds will be used to establish the initial endowment for the Illyrian Foundation." The board erupted in applause. Alara and Liam exchanged a small private smile. They were not just business partners. They were partners in building a new kind of legacy. That legacy's most visible symbol was the former Vanderbilt estate. The grand, oppressive mansion had been reborn. The imposing gates now stood wide open, a discreet new sign on the stone pillar reading, "The Illyrian Foundation, a home for hope." The grand ballroom, the site of Alara's greatest humiliation, was now a vibrant, state-of-the-art learning center. Where glittering chandeliers once hung, there were now bright, energy-efficient lights. Where guests had once gossiped over champagne, dozens of teenagers from the city's foster care system now sat at computer terminals, learning to code from volunteer instructors from the Illyrian Sterling Corporation. The air, once thick with perfume, was now filled with the buzz of excited conversation and the boundless energy of potential being unleashed. The library, Alara's former sanctuary and war room, had been expanded into a public resource. Its collection modernized, its doors open to the community. The West Terrace, where Damian had unleashed his venomous insults, was now a calm green space where younger children were read stories on sunny afternoons. Alara had turned her gilded cage into a key, unlocking the potential of hundreds of children who, like her, had been told they were worthless. She did not live at the foundation. She and Liam had bought a modest, comfortable house in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood downtown. She had spent enough of her life in a palace. She wanted a home. One crisp autumn afternoon, Alara was walking through the gardens of the foundation, the place where her revolution had quietly begun. The leaves of the maple trees were a riot of red and gold. She saw a familiar figure kneeling by the rose bushes, carefully tending to the peace rose that had become the foundation's unofficial symbol. It was Serafina. In the past year, she had been true to her word. She had started in the mailroom, a ghost in a new machine enduring the whispers and the stares. But she had not quit. She had been promoted twice through sheer dogged persistence. She was now a junior administrative assistant, a small but significant step up the ladder she was building for herself. She volunteered in the foundation's gardens on the weekends. It was, she had told a surprised Alara, once the only place she felt quiet. She looked up as Alara approached, a smudge of dirt on her cheek. The old hollow beauty was gone, replaced by a resilience that was far more compelling. "The roses are doing well this year," Serafina said, her voice even. There was no subservience in it, but also no trace of the old entitlement. It was simply the voice of an employee speaking to her CEO. "Thank you for taking care of them," Serafina Alara replied, her tone equally professional. "Your work is appreciated." They stood in a comfortable silence for a moment, two women bound by a violent, complicated history, now occupying a new, peaceful present. The past was not forgotten, but it no longer had the power to poison them. "I have to get back to the city," Alara said finally. "Liam is making dinner." "Give him my best," Serafina replied, with a small, genuine smile, and turned back to her roses. Alara walked down the familiar path toward the front gates, a sense of profound peace settling over her. She had not just reclaimed her name and her fortune. She had reclaimed her life, and in doing so had given countless others the chance to build their own. She had faced the darkness of her past, and had chosen not to reflect it, but to transform it into light. Liam was waiting for her by the car, his hazel eyes warm. He opened the door for her, then got in beside her. "Everything good at the foundation?" he asked, taking her hand. "Everything is perfect," she said, her fingers lacing with his. As they drove away, Alara looked back at the mansion, no longer a symbol of oppression and lies, but a beacon of hope, her hope shining brightly against the twilight sky. The legacy of the Vanderbilts was dead. The legacy of the Illyrians was just beginning. True worth is not a thing of inheritance of glittering ballrooms or titles bestowed by birth. It is a quiet, resilient seed that can lie dormant in the harshest of soils, waiting for a single ray of light to break through the stone. We are taught to judge by the surface, to measure a person's value by the clothes they wear, the name they carry, or the home they inhabit. But the greatest treasures, the most brilliant minds, and the strongest souls are often found in the places we have been taught to overlook. This was the story of a girl who was raised in a cage of lies, but who learned that the only true prison is one of the spirit. It is a story of revenge, yes, but a revenge not of destruction, but of creation. For the greatest victory over those who seek to diminish us is not to sink to their level, but to rise so far above it that they are left behind, forgotten in the shadow of the beautiful, powerful new world we build. The ultimate power is not the ability to crush your enemies, but the wisdom to turn your own pain into a source of healing for others. That is the legacy that endures. Thank you for joining us on this journey. We are deeply grateful for the time you have spent with these characters and their story. If their struggles and triumphs resonated with you, please consider showing your support by liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more stories that explore the depths of the human heart. Your support allows us to continue bringing these narratives to life. We look forward to seeing you again soon.